The rain had been falling since noon, turning the quiet streets of Millbrook into a blur of gray and silver. By evening, the downpour had become relentless, the kind of rain that soaked through coats and turned gutters into rivers. Most people had retreated indoors, leaving Main Street nearly deserted except for the occasional car splashing past, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Sarah Chen stood under the awning of her small bakery, keys in hand, ready to lock up for the night. She was tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after a long day of rolling dough and smiling at customers. At 47, she'd learned to find contentment in routine. The early mornings, the smell of bread rising, the familiar faces who stopped by for coffee and conversation. It wasn't the life she'd once imagined, but it was hers, and it was enough. That's when she noticed him. Across the street, barely visible through the sheets of rain, a figure sat slumped on the bus stop bench. No umbrella, no coat that she could see. Just sitting there, shoulders hunched as the rain poured down on him like the world had forgotten he existed. Sarah squinted through the downpour, her hand tightening around her keys. Something about the stillness of him made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Concern, maybe, or recognition of a loneliness she understood too well. She should go home, mind her own business, but her feet wouldn't move toward her car. Sarah's mother used to say that kindness didn't cost anything, but standing there in the rain, Sarah knew that wasn't quite true. Kindness cost comfort. It cost safety. It cost the easy choice of looking away. She glanced back at her car, parked just 20 feet away in the small lot behind the bakery. The engine would be warm in minutes. She could be home in 10, wrapped in her bathrobe with a cup of tea, watching the rain from behind her window like everyone else. The man across the street was someone else's problem. Or maybe he wasn't a problem at all. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he wanted to be left alone. But the rain kept falling, and he didn't move. Sarah took a breath and stepped out from under the awning. The cold hit her immediately, droplets sliding down her neck and soaking into her cardigan. She hurried across the empty street, her shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the yellow glow of the streetlights above. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe early 30s. His hair was dark and plastered to his forehead, his clothes simple and worn. Faded jeans, a thin gray hoodie that clung to him like a second skin. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, as if he'd simply surrendered to the weather. He didn't look at her as she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, her voice nearly swallowed by the rain. He lifted his head slowly, and for a moment their eyes met. His were dark brown, rimmed with exhaustion, and there was something in them. Not hostility, not fear, but a deep, quiet resignation that made Sarah's heart ache. "Are you all right?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He didn't answer right away, just stared at her like he was trying to remember what words were for. Then, finally, a single nod, so slight she almost missed it. "The bus stopped running an hour ago," Sarah said, gesturing to the empty street. "You'll be waiting all night out here." "I know." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, as if he hadn't used it in days. Sarah hesitated, water dripping from her hair into her eyes. There was something fragile about him, like a glass figurine balanced on the edge of a shelf. She'd seen that look before, in her brother's eyes after he came back from overseas, before the drinking started, before they stopped talking altogether. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," she offered. "It's warm. They serve coffee until midnight." He shook his head slowly. "I'm fine here." But he wasn't fine. Anyone could see that. Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or something else, she couldn't tell. Then her eyes caught on something. A small military patch sewn onto the shoulder of his hoodie, faded and fraying at the edges. An eagle and anchor. Marine Corps. "Thank you," he said suddenly, standing up with difficulty, as if his legs weren't quite willing to hold him. He was taller than she'd expected. "For checking on me. Not many people would." He started to walk away, limping slightly, heading toward the darker end of Main Street where the streetlights gave out, and the road disappeared into nothing. "Wait," Sarah called after him. But something fell from his pocket as he moved, a small metallic clink against the wet pavement. He didn't notice, didn't turn back, just kept walking until the rain swallowed him whole. Sarah rushed forward and bent down, her fingers closing around something cold and smooth. A dog tag, military issue, with a name stamped into the metal, and an address in Millbrook. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the dog tag resting in front of her like an accusation. The name etched into the metal read, CPL James M. Holloway. Below it, a blood type and a serial number, the kind of information that only mattered when everything else had gone wrong. The address was local, Maple Ridge Drive, just outside town. She could look him up, return it properly. But something held her back, a feeling that this wasn't just about a lost piece of metal. This was about a man who'd been sitting in the rain because he had nowhere else to go. She thought about her brother again, how he'd come home different, how the silence in his eyes had eventually become permanent. Morning came too quickly. Sarah opened the bakery at 6 as always, going through the familiar motions of preheating ovens and arranging pastries in the display case. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the image of the stranger on the bench, the weight of his exhaustion. By 8 o'clock, the morning regulars had filtered in. That's when Margaret Finch arrived, 72, president of the Millbrook Neighborhood Watch, and the unofficial keeper of everyone's business. "Sarah, dear," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the shop. "I heard something disturbing. Bonnie Jenkins said she saw you talking to some homeless man last night. In the rain, no less." Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Several customers turned to listen. "He wasn't homeless. He was just—" "Sitting in the rain like a vagrant?" Margaret interrupted, her eyes sharp. "You know we've had problems with drifters lately. The pharmacy was broken into last month. We can't encourage them to hang around." "He's a veteran," Sarah said quietly. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "They all say that. It's a sympathy tactic." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, though everyone could still hear. "You're too trusting, Sarah, especially now, with your situation." Sarah's jaw tightened. Her situation. That's what everyone called it, as if reducing it to two vague words made it less humiliating. 3 months behind on rent for the bakery. The landlord's lawyer had sent papers last week. She had until the end of the month to come up with $12,000 or lose everything. "I'm just saying," Margaret continued, "you should be focused on saving your business, not inviting trouble." The bell above the door chimed as Margaret left, taking half the warmth in the room with her. The remaining customers suddenly found their coffee very interesting. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up her neck, not because Margaret was right, but because in this town, perception was everything. And right now, Sarah Chen, the struggling baker who couldn't pay her bills, had no business being anyone's good Samaritan. She slipped her hand into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the dog tag. Some things mattered more than perception. 2 days passed. Sarah kept the dog tag in her pocket, its edges growing warm from being handled too often. She'd looked up the address online but couldn't bring herself to drive out there. What would she say? What if he didn't want to be found? Thursday afternoon brought a rare break in the weather. pale sunlight filtering through thinning clouds. Sarah was restocking the bread baskets when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up and froze. It was him, but different. He stood in the doorway wearing clean clothes, dark jeans and a pressed button-down shirt under a jacket. His hair was trimmed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his eyes that had changed most. They were clearer now, focused, though they still carried shadows that wouldn't fade with soap and water. "Hi," he said simply. Sarah's hand went instinctively to her apron pocket. "I have something of yours." She pulled out the dog tag and held it toward him. He crossed the small shop in 3 strides and took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly. They were steady now. No trembling. "James Holloway," he said, as if introducing himself for the first time. "I should have said that the other night. I wasn't in a good place." "Are you okay now?" Sarah asked softly. He considered the question, turning the dog tag over in his palm. "Getting there. I went to the VA clinic the next morning, started talking to someone." He looked up at her, something like gratitude flickering across his face. "You could have just walked past me. Everyone else did." "I almost did," Sarah admitted. "But you didn't." He slipped the dog tag into his pocket. "I came to say thank you, and to ask if you needed any help around here. I'm good with my hands, repairs, painting, whatever needs doing." Sarah opened her mouth to politely decline, but the words caught in her throat. Behind James, through the front window, she saw Margaret Finch walking past. The older woman stopped, stared, then pulled out her phone. This was about to get complicated. James started coming by the bakery every morning. He fixed the loose hinge on the oven door, replaced the flickering light fixture in the back room, patched the leak in the ceiling that Sarah had been ignoring for months. He didn't talk much, but his presence was steady, a quiet kind of reliability that Sarah had forgotten could exist. The town, however, had opinions. Margaret Finch made sure of that. Within a week, half of Millbrook had heard some version of the story. Sarah Chen was letting a strange man work in her bakery. A drifter. Possibly dangerous. Definitely suspicious. Several of her regular customers stopped coming. Others came just to gossip, their eyes sliding toward James as he worked, their whispers not quite quiet enough. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment but refused to bend under it. James needed this. The purpose, the routine. The reminder that he still had something to offer. And truthfully, so did she. It was a Friday evening, just past 7, when everything changed. Sarah was in the back, going over the bills she couldn't pay, while James finished repainting the storage room. The bakery had been closed for an hour, the front door locked, the lights in the display area dimmed. That's when she smelled it. Smoke. Not the familiar smell of burnt bread, but something acrid and wrong. Sarah's head snapped up. Through the doorway to the front room, she saw a flicker of orange light dancing across the ceiling. "James!" Her voice came out strangled. He was beside her in seconds, and together they rushed to the front. Flames were climbing up the curtains by the front window, feeding on the old fabric like it had been waiting years for this moment. The fire was spreading fast, too fast, reaching toward the wooden shelves, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the ancient electrical wiring that ran through the walls. "Get out!" James shouted, pushing her towards the back door. But Sarah couldn't move. This was everything. Her mother's recipes, her father's equipment, 15 years of her life burning away in front of her eyes. The business she'd already lost a dozen times in her mind was now disappearing in reality. James grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall, a small residential model that wouldn't be nearly enough, and attacked the base of the flames. Sarah found another one under the counter, her hands shaking so badly she almost couldn't pull the pin. Together they fought the fire, the smoke thickening, filling their lungs, making their eyes stream. Outside, someone had seen the smoke. Sarah heard shouting, the wail of sirens growing closer. The front door rattled as someone tried to get in. "We have to go," James coughed, his face streaked with soot, but Sarah saw it, a small glass bottle on the floor near where the fire had started. It didn't belong there, and beside it, a piece of fabric that looked like it had been stuffed through the mail slot. This wasn't an accident. The fire department arrived within minutes, bursting through the door with hoses and equipment. Chief Patterson, a man Sarah had known since high school, pulled them both outside into the cold air. Sarah's legs gave out on the sidewalk, and she sat there watching firefighters pour water through her windows, steam rising into the night sky. James sat beside her, his breathing labored, his hands still clutching the empty fire extinguisher. A crowd had gathered. Sarah saw familiar faces, some concerned, some curious, some satisfaction masked as shock. Margaret Finch stood at the front, her phone out, recording everything. Chief Patterson crouched in front of them, his expression grim. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Do you have any idea who might want to do this?" Sarah's mind was reeling. "Do what?" "This was arson," he said quietly. "Someone put something flammable through your mail slot and lit it on fire." The words didn't make sense at first. Then, slowly, they did. Someone had tried to burn down her bakery. James stood abruptly, his jaw tight. "I saw someone," he said. "Right before we smelled the smoke. A figure walking away fast down the alley. I thought it was just someone passing by, but—" "Can you describe them?" Patterson asked. Before James could answer, a voice cut through the crowd. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about!" Margaret Finch pushed forward, pointing at James. "Strange men hanging around, and now look what happens. This is what you get for—" "Mrs. Finch." Chief Patterson's voice was steel. "That's enough." But the damage was done. Sarah saw the looks, heard the murmurs. In their minds, James wasn't the person who'd helped her fight the fire. He was the outsider. The easy explanation. Sarah struggled to her feet, her voice raw from smoke. "He was with me the entire time. He saved—" A young firefighter emerged from the bakery carrying evidence bags. Inside one was the bottle. Inside another, a piece of fabric. And pinned to the fabric was a note, written in angry capital letters. "Stop helping trash. Next time it'll be worse." The investigation moved quickly after that. Chief Patterson took the note seriously. Threats of violence weren't something Millbrook took lightly, no matter who they were directed at. Within 24 hours, security footage from the pharmacy across the street had been reviewed, and a figure had been identified slipping down the alley behind Sarah's bakery at 7:03 p.m. The figure belonged to Tyler Maines, Margaret Finch's 26-year-old nephew. When Patterson brought him in for questioning, Tyler cracked almost immediately. He admitted to starting the fire, said he was trying to send a message about the vagrant problem in town. His aunt had been complaining for weeks about how Sarah was encouraging dangerous people, how property values would drop, how someone needed to do something before things got worse. Margaret herself was horrified, or at least she performed horror convincingly. She swore she'd never suggested anything violent, that Tyler had misunderstood, that she was just concerned about the community. But the damage to her reputation was immediate and irreversible. The woman who'd appointed herself the town's moral guardian had inspired an act of arson against one of their own. The truth spread through Millbrook faster than the fire had spread through Sarah's bakery. By Monday morning, something had shifted. Sarah arrived at the bakery, still reeking of smoke, the walls blackened, the windows boarded up, to find a crowd gathered outside. But this time, They weren't whispering or recording. They were holding coffee thermoses and cleaning supplies. Tom Brennan, who owned the hardware store, stepped forward first. "We're here to help rebuild," he said simply. "If you'll have us." Sarah's throat tightened. Behind Tom stood at least 30 people. Some she knew well, some who'd stopped coming to the bakery weeks ago, some she'd never spoken to at all. They carried paint cans and brushes, replacement fixtures and lumber, sandwiches and water bottles. James appeared beside her, his hands in his pockets. He'd been staying at the VA transitional housing across town, but he'd shown up every day since the fire, helping her sort through what could be salvaged. "Looks like you've got some volunteers," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been hope. Over the next 3 weeks, the bakery was transformed. The community that had judged Sarah for helping a stranger now worked alongside that same stranger to rebuild what hatred had tried to destroy. James coordinated the repairs with the precision of someone who'd once led men through far more dangerous situations. He taught young volunteers how to properly install drywall, showed the older ones efficient painting techniques, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, began talking more, smiling occasionally, joining conversations instead of hovering at their edges. The insurance money came through, enough to cover the damages and 3 months of back rent. Sarah's landlord, shamed by the public outcry, agreed to renegotiate her lease at a lower rate. But the real shift wasn't in the building or the bank account. It was in the faces of the people who'd once looked away, who now met her eyes and nodded with something that looked like respect. On the day the bakery reopened, Sarah placed something new on the wall behind the counter. A shadow box containing James's dog tag, which he'd insisted she keep. Below it, a small plaque read, "Kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything." James stood beside her as the first customers filed in, and when he caught her looking at the display, he simply nodded. Some debts could never be fully repaid, but they could be honored, remembered, and passed forward. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her bakery, no longer smoke-stained, no longer sagging under the weight of neglect. The walls were painted a warm cream color, the equipment hummed reliably, and through the window she could see the small garden James had helped her plant in the narrow strip of earth behind the building. Tomatoes climbed their stakes, herbs sprawled in wild abundance, and a wooden bench sat beneath the single maple tree, a place to rest when the ovens got too hot. The bakery had become something more than it was before. James worked there now, officially, not just fixing things, but baking alongside her, his hands learning the rhythm of kneading dough the way they'd once learned to field strip a rifle. He'd brought 2 other veterans with him, men from his support group who needed purpose as much as he once had. The bakery had become their anchor, their mission, their way back. On Thursdays, they offered free coffee and pastries to anyone who served. The small shop filled with stories and laughter, with the kind of camaraderie that transcended age and circumstance. Sarah watched James showing one of the younger vets, a kid named Marcus who couldn't have been more than 23, how to score the top of a sourdough loaf. Marcus's hands shook slightly, but James was patient, his voice steady and encouraging. She thought about that rainy night, about how close she'd come to simply walking to her car and driving away, how easy it would have been to choose comfort over compassion. One act of kindness. That's all it had been, really. A moment of seeing someone else's pain and deciding it mattered. But kindness was never just one thing. It was a seed that grew in unexpected directions, roots spreading through soil you couldn't see, branches reaching toward people you'd never meet. The rain had stopped months ago, but what it had washed into her life remained. A reminder that the smallest gestures can carry the greatest weight, and that sometimes saving someone else is how we save ourselves. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, and Sarah smiled. Thank you for staying with us until the end of Sarah and James's story. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change everything, not just for those we help, but for ourselves and our communities too. If this story touched your heart, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories about everyday heroes who choose kindness when it costs them something, who see dignity in others when the world looks away. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that goodness still exists, that one person truly can make a difference. Until next time, remember, we all have the power to be someone's turning point. Sometimes it starts with simply stopping in the rain